My mom looked me dead in the eye and said my lunch wasn't worth rearranging her evening, because my brother had a poker night. That sentence didn't just land, it settled into my chest like something familiar, something rehearsed, like she had said different versions of it my entire life and just swapped out the occasion. I remember standing there in my apartment kitchen, phone still warm in my hand, staring at the confirmation email for the biggest night of my career while she talked like it was a scheduling inconvenience. I had spent 14 months building that company from nothing, late nights, early mornings, skipping vacations, eating takeout at my desk until I forgot what a normal routine even felt like, and all I had asked was that my family show up for 2 hours. 2 hours. That was it. It's just a launch, she said, her voice light, almost amused, like I was being dramatic for expecting more. Your brother already planned his poker night, and he needs me there. Needs her. I actually laughed when she said that, not because it was funny, but because something in me recognized the pattern before I could stop it. My brother always needed something. Attention. Backup. An audience. And somehow, no matter what I had going on, his needs always came first. It's one night, Mom, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to sound like I was asking for something unreasonable. This matters to me. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that isn't silence but judgment. You're doing fine on your own, she replied. You always have. He doesn't have that kind of stability. That was the moment it shifted for me, not exploded, not snapped, just shifted. Because she wasn't even pretending anymore. She wasn't saying she couldn't come. She was saying she chose not to. Chose him. Again. I looked around my apartment, at the boxes of branded materials stacked by the wall, the garment bag hanging on the door with the outfit I had picked out weeks ago, the guest list printed and sitting on the counter with my parents' names highlighted near the top like they actually meant something. So you're not coming, I said, not as a question this time. No, she answered, simple, final. We'll celebrate another time. We. That word almost made me smile. Because it had never really been we, not in the way I needed it to be. It was always conditional, always convenient, always secondary to whatever my brother had going on. I ended the call without arguing. That was the part that surprised me the most. I didn't push. I didn't remind her how many times I had shown up for him, how many times I had covered for him, helped him, cleaned up after his messes while everyone called it being supportive. I didn't mention the graduation they barely attended, the promotion dinner they left early, the birthdays that somehow turned into conversations about him. I just stood there, phone in my hand, and let it settle. Because deep down, I already knew something they didn't. And that changed everything. The night of the launch, the room was full, investors, partners, people who had believed in me before I even believed in myself, but every time the door opened, there was a part of me that looked up anyway, like maybe they would surprise me, like maybe this time would be different. It wasn't. People kept asking the same question in different ways. Your family here tonight? Are your parents coming later? You must be proud, they must be proud. I smiled through every version of it. They couldn't make it, I said, over and over, like it didn't matter, like it was just logistics and not something deeper. And the whole time I could hear her voice in my head. He needs me there. By the time the night ended, I had shaken hands, given my speech, signed deals, taken photos, and thanked people who had shown up for me in ways my own family never had. And still, I didn't call her. I didn't text. I didn't even check my phone. Because for the first time I wasn't waiting for their approval. I wasn't hoping they'd finally see me. I already knew what was coming next. And they had no idea. I got home a little after 11 that night, heels in one hand, phone still untouched in my bag, and the silence in my apartment felt different than it had that morning, heavier but clearer, like something had finally settled into place instead of hanging over me. I set the keys down, walked past the stack of leftover materials from the event, and poured myself a glass of water because I realized I had barely had anything to drink that was not coffee or adrenaline for the past 12 hours. The city outside my window was still alive, headlights moving in steady lines, people going about their nights like nothing had shifted, but for me everything had. Not because of what they did, but because of what I finally understood. I had spent years thinking if I just worked harder, showed up more, proved myself enough, they would eventually meet me halfway. That there was some invisible threshold I had not reached yet. But standing there in that quiet apartment, I realized there was no threshold. There never had been. The rules were never the same for me as they were for my brother. I was the one expected to be stable, dependable, low maintenance. He was the one allowed to be messy, unpredictable, in need. And my parents had built their entire dynamic around that difference. I sat down at the kitchen counter and finally pulled my phone out of my bag. No missed calls. No messages. Not from my mom, not from my dad, not even from my brother. For a second, I just stared at the screen, waiting for something to feel like it usually did, that small sting of disappointment, that familiar pull to reach out first and keep the peace. But it did not come. Instead, there was just quiet. Clean, almost. I unlocked the phone, opened my email, and scrolled past the congratulations messages, the follow-ups, the early interest from people who suddenly saw value in what I had built. And then I saw the one message I had been expecting. It had come in hours earlier, right in the middle of my speech, time-stamped down to the minute like everything else that mattered in this situation. I opened it slowly, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to take it in exactly as it was. The subject line was short, formal, and unmistakable. I read it once, then again, letting the weight of it settle in the same way my mother's words had earlier that day, except this time it felt different. Controlled. Earned. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled, a long breath I had not realized I had been holding for months. So that is how this is going to go, I said out loud, not to anyone, just to hear it. Because everything suddenly made sense. The timing, the distance, the way my father had been unusually quiet the last few weeks, the way my mother had avoided certain topics whenever I brought them up. They had been moving pieces behind the scenes, assuming I would stay exactly where I had always been. Available. Reliable. Easy to overlook. I closed the email and set the phone down again, this time face up on the counter. I did not call them. I did not send a message. I did not give them a chance to control the narrative before it even started. Instead, I got up, changed out of my event clothes, and hung the outfit carefully back in the closet like I was putting away something complete, something finished. Because that was what it felt like. Not the end of the night, but the end of a version of me that kept waiting for them to show up. I brushed my hair out slowly, methodically, watching my reflection in the mirror and trying to see if anything looked different. It did not. Same face. Same person. But the way I held myself had shifted, just slightly, like I had finally stepped into something I had been circling for years. Before going to bed, I checked my phone one more time. Still nothing. And that told me everything I needed to know. They did not reach out because, in their minds, nothing important had happened. My launch was just another thing I would handle on my own. Just like always. I turned off the lights, walked to the bedroom, and lay down without setting an alarm, which was something I had not done in a long time. As I stared at the ceiling, I thought about what the next morning would bring, not with anxiety, but with a kind of calm certainty. Because when they finally realized what had actually changed, it would not be subtle. And by the time they decided they needed me, it would already be too late to pretend they had been there all along. The next morning did not start with noise or urgency or anything dramatic at all, which somehow made it feel even more precise, like the calm before something inevitable finally surfaced. I woke up without an alarm, sunlight already coming through the blinds, and for a few seconds I just lay there, letting the quiet sit without reaching for my phone the way I used to. There was no rush, no anxiety, no need to check if I had missed something overnight. Because I already knew what was waiting. I got up slowly, made coffee, and moved through my kitchen like it was any other day, except it was not. Every step felt intentional, grounded, like I was finally moving on my own timeline instead of reacting to theirs. I picked up my phone after the first sip, not because I needed to, but because I was ready to see it. 12 missed calls. 8 from my mom, 3 from my dad, 1 from my brother. And a line of messages stacked under them, each one more urgent than the last. Call me as soon as you wake up. We need to talk. This is important. Why are you not answering? I scrolled through them without opening any of them at first, just reading the previews like headlines that told me everything I needed to know. The shift had already happened. I set the phone down again and took another sip of coffee, letting the moment stretch a little longer than necessary. Because for once, I was not the one reacting. They were. When I finally opened the first message, it was from my mom, sent at 6:12 in the morning. Sweetheart, please call me. Something came up. The word sweetheart almost made me laugh. It had not been there the day before. It had not been there when she told me my launch was not worth her evening. But now, suddenly, it was back. I opened the next message, then the next, watching the tone shift in real time from controlled to uneasy to something closer to panic. My dad's messages were shorter, more direct. We need to discuss the situation. This affects all of us. That phrasing told me more than anything else. Affects all of us. Which meant whatever had changed was not small, not private, not something they could ignore or spin. I leaned back against the counter and let out a quiet breath, not surprised, just confirmed. I tapped on the missed call from my brother last. The one message he had left sitting under everything else. It was only a few words. Can you call me? It is kind of urgent. No attitude. No sarcasm. No edge. Just, careful. That was new. I set the phone down again and looked out the window, watching the street below come to life. People heading to work, cars pulling out of driveways, everything moving forward like it always did. And I thought about the difference between yesterday and today. Less than 24 hours. That was all it took. Yesterday, I was the one standing in a room full of people, pretending it did not matter that my family had chosen something else over me. Today, they were the ones reaching out, trying to close a gap they had never cared about before. I walked back to the counter and picked up the phone again, this time opening the email I had seen the night before. The one that explained everything without needing emotion or interpretation. It laid out the facts clearly, professionally, the kind of language my father respected because it did not leave room for denial. I read through it again, slower this time, letting each line settle into place. The ownership structure. The control clauses. The part that made it unmistakable who actually had the final say. When I reached the end, I closed the email and locked the phone, holding it in my hand for a second longer than necessary. Because this was the part where everything could go back to the old pattern if I let it. If I rushed to respond, if I tried to fix it, if I stepped back into the role they had always expected. But I did not move. I did not call. I did not text. Instead, I set the phone down on the counter again, face up this time, and let it sit there while it started to ring once more. My mom's name lit up the screen, bright and persistent, the call going through like it had every other time in my life. Only this time, I did not reach for it. I just stood there, watching it vibrate against the countertop, listening to the sound echo slightly in the quiet kitchen. And for the first time, I understood something clearly enough that it did not even feel emotional anymore. They were not calling because they missed me. They were not calling because they regretted yesterday. They were calling because something had changed, and they needed access to it. To me. And that difference was everything. The phone stopped ringing after the fourth call, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the sound itself, like the room was waiting to see what I would do next, but I already knew I was not going to move the way I used to. I walked over to the window again, coffee still warm in my hand, and watched as a delivery truck pulled up across the street, the driver moving quickly, focused, like he had a route to follow and no time to second-guess it. That was what this felt like now. A route. A direction I was not going to deviate from just because someone else suddenly needed access to it. My phone lit up again, this time with a text instead of a call. My mom. Please answer. This is serious. I read it once and set the phone down without responding, not out of anger, not even out of spite, but because I needed to see how far they would go without me stepping in to stabilize it for them. That had always been my role. The one who answers. The one who fixes. The one who keeps things from escalating. And I wanted to know what happened when that role was removed. Less than 30 seconds later, another message came through, this time from my dad. We need to talk today. There are legal implications here. That word again. Legal. He would not use it unless he had to. Unless the situation had moved beyond family dynamics and into something structured, something that could not be smoothed over with a conversation at dinner or a casual apology that never actually addressed anything. I picked up the phone and opened the message thread fully now, reading everything in order instead of in fragments. My mom's tone had shifted completely. No more soft language, no more pretending this was about reconnecting or checking in. We were not aware of the details. You should have told us. This affects your brother. There it was. Not me. Not us. Him. It always came back to him. I exhaled slowly and leaned back against the counter, letting that realization settle in the same way it always had. Except this time it did not pull anything out of me. It just confirmed what I had already accepted. My brother called again, and this time I let it ring longer before it went to voicemail. A few seconds later, the notification came through, and I opened it without hesitation. His voice was different. Lower. Controlled, but not confident. Hey. I do not know if you have seen what came through this morning, but we need to talk. Mom and Dad are kind of freaking out. There is something in there that I do not think they understood before. Can you just call me back? He paused, like he wanted to say more, then stopped himself. It is important. I replayed the message once, then set the phone down again. Important. That word carried weight now in a way it never had when it came from them. Because when something was important to me, it had been optional. Flexible. Something they could attend if it fit their schedule. But when something became important to them, it suddenly required urgency, attention, immediate access. I walked back to the table and pulled out the printed documents I had brought home from the event the night before, the ones I had not even looked at yet because I had not needed to. Everything I needed had already been confirmed. Still, I flipped through them slowly, scanning the language, the signatures, the structure that made it all official in a way they could not ignore. My name appeared where theirs did not. My control where they had assumed shared access. My decisions where they had expected influence. It was not emotional. It was not personal. It was just clear. My phone rang again, and this time I picked it up, not to answer, but to silence it before it could go to voicemail again. I held it in my hand, feeling the vibration fade under my fingers, and for a second I thought about what would happen if I answered. The conversation would start with urgency, then shift to explanation, then to justification, and eventually to expectation. They would try to reframe everything, to make it sound like a misunderstanding, like something that could be fixed if I just stepped in and helped them navigate it. But this was the part they had never accounted for. I did not need them to understand anymore. I needed them to recognize the reality of it. I set the phone back down and let it sit there in silence, the screen going dark again after a few seconds, like it had nothing left to say unless I chose to engage with it. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to close that gap for them. Because the distance between us was no longer something I was trying to fix. It was something they were finally forced to face. I left the documents spread across the table longer than I needed to, not because I was still trying to understand them, but because I was remembering all the times I had been told I did not understand anything important. My dad used to say that a lot, usually with that quiet confidence that made it sound like a fact instead of an opinion. You do not see the bigger picture, He would tell me whenever I questioned a decision, especially if it involved my brother. And for years, I believed him. I thought maybe there was something I was missing, some perspective I had not earned yet. But standing there in my own apartment, looking at pages that had my name where theirs was supposed to be, I realized I had always seen the bigger picture. I just was not included in theirs. My phone buzzed again, breaking the silence in a way that felt sharper now, more urgent. This time it was not a call or a short message. It was a long text from my mom, and I could tell before opening it that she had shifted into explanation mode. That was always her next step when control started slipping. I unlocked the phone and read it slowly. We did not know it was structured like this. Your father assumed it was still under family oversight. You should have told us when things changed. This puts your brother in a very difficult position. I read that last sentence twice, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to feel exactly how it landed. Not surprise. Not concern. Just distance. Even now, with everything clearly laid out, it was still about him. His position. His situation. His problem. I typed out a response without thinking at first, something simple, direct, something that would have closed the gap the way I always had. Then I stopped. I looked at the words on the screen and realized they belonged to a version of me that did not exist anymore. The one who explained herself. The one who softened things. The one who made sure everyone else was comfortable, even when she was not. I deleted the message and set the phone down again. A few seconds later, another text came through, this time from my dad. Call me now. This cannot wait. The tone was different. Less controlled. More direct. He was not trying to frame it anymore. He was trying to access it. I could almost hear his voice behind the words, the way it would tighten slightly when something did not go according to plan, the way he would expect immediate response because that was how it had always worked. I walked over to the sink, rinsed out my coffee cup, and set it in the rack, taking my time with small movements that grounded me in the moment instead of pulling me back into theirs. Because that was what they were doing now. Pulling. Trying to bring me back into a dynamic that only worked when I responded on their timeline. My brother's name lit up the screen again, and this time he followed the call with another message before it even finished ringing. This is not what we thought it was. Dad is saying you have full control. Is that true? I stared at the question, the way it was phrased, the uncertainty in it, and I realized something that shifted the entire situation into focus. He had never asked me anything like that before. Not because he did not care, but because he had never needed to. The structure had always worked in his favor. The assumptions had always protected him. But now, for the first time, he was asking instead of assuming. I picked up the phone and walked back to the table, the documents still laid out exactly where I had left them, the ink on the pages as clear as it had been the night before. My name. My authority. My decisions. I could feel the weight of it now, not as pressure, but as something solid, something real that did not depend on anyone else acknowledging it to exist. The phone buzzed again in my hand. Another call, another attempt, and I let it ring while I looked at everything in front of me, connecting the pieces that had been there all along. The quiet comments from my dad about restructuring. The subtle questions about timelines. The way my mom had avoided certain conversations whenever I brought up long-term plans. They had been moving around me, assuming I would stay exactly where I had always been. Predictable. Accessible. Easy to manage. And now, suddenly, they were on the outside of something they thought they controlled. I set the phone down one more time, letting the call go unanswered again, and for a moment I just stood there, completely still, taking in the silence that followed. Because this was the part no one had prepared me for. Not the success. Not the recognition. But this. The moment where everything shifted and I had to decide whether I was going to step back into the role they expected or stand in the one I had built for myself. And for the first time, the answer did not feel complicated at all. I did not answer any of the calls for the next hour, not because I was unsure, but because I needed to let the pressure build on their side without me diffusing it the way I always had. That was the pattern I was breaking, and I could feel it in the way the messages kept coming faster, shorter, less controlled. My mom again. Please, this is getting complicated. My dad right after. You are making this harder than it needs to be. That line almost made me smile because it sounded so familiar. Every time I did not immediately comply, it became about me making things difficult, not about the situation they created or the assumptions they made. I picked up my phone and scrolled through everything again, not to reconsider, but to observe how quickly the tone had shifted from expectation to urgency to something closer to pressure. My brother's name appeared again, this time with a longer message than before. I just spoke to Dad. He is saying there are restrictions we did not account for. Something about ownership percentages and approval rights. If that is true, we need to figure this out together before it becomes a problem. I read that twice. Slower the second time, because of the word together. That word had never included me before. Not when decisions were made, not when plans were set, not when roles were assigned. Together only appeared when something stopped working without me. I set the phone down and walked into the living room, the sunlight shifting across the floor as the morning moved forward, everything outside continuing like nothing had changed while inside my world had completely recalibrated. I sat down on the couch and leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to think clearly without the constant vibration of notifications pulling me back into their urgency. Because this was the part that required precision. Not emotion. Not reaction. Just clarity. I thought about the last time my dad had mentioned restructuring anything. It had been casual, almost dismissive, like he was talking out loud more than directly to me. We might need to revisit how things are set up, he had said a few weeks ago over dinner, his tone neutral, controlled. I had asked what he meant, and he waved it off. Just logistics. Nothing you need to worry about. That sentence stayed with me now more than anything else. Nothing you need to worry about. Because what he meant was nothing you need to be involved in. They had made decisions assuming I would not question them, assuming I would remain in the position they had always placed me in. And now, for the first time, they were dealing with the consequences of that assumption. My phone buzzed again, breaking the quiet, and I opened the latest message without hesitation this time. It was from my mom, shorter, sharper. Your father is saying you have final authority on this. Is that accurate? I looked at the screen for a second longer than necessary, not because I needed to confirm it, but because I could feel the shift in her tone. The softness was gone. The reassurance was gone. This was direct now. Focused. She was no longer trying to guide the conversation. She was trying to understand her position in it. I stood up and walked back to the table, the documents still spread out exactly as they had been, untouched but fully understood. I placed my phone down next to them and looked at both, side by side, the messages on one side, the reality on the other. And for the first time, there was no overlap. No confusion. No gray area. Just a clear line between what they thought and what actually was. The phone rang again, my dad this time, and I let it go to voicemail before opening the message he left immediately after. His voice was tighter now, less controlled than before. We need to speak today. This is not optional. Call me back. I replayed it once, then set the phone down again, the words echoing slightly in the quiet room. Not optional. That was how it had always been framed when it came to their needs. Immediate. Required. Expected. But this time it was different. Because for the first time, the option was entirely mine. I walked over to the window again, looking out at the street, the same steady movement, the same rhythm, and I realized something that settled everything into place. They were not asking because they respected my role. They were asking because they had just discovered it. And there was a difference between those two things that changed how I was going to respond. I turned back toward the table, toward the phone, toward everything that had shifted in less than a day, and I knew that whatever happened next was not going to follow the old script. Because I was not the same person they had been counting on. Not anymore. I picked up the phone before it rang again, not out of urgency, but because I had decided this was the moment everything shifted from assumption to reality, and I wanted to control exactly how that happened. I tapped my dad's name and let it ring once, twice, before he answered almost immediately, like he had been holding the phone in his hand waiting for it. Finally, he said, his voice tight, controlled but strained underneath, "We need to talk about what is going on." I did not sit down, did not move, just stood there by the table with the documents in front of me. "We can talk," I said calmly, "but I am not going to react to panic." There was a pause on the other end, brief but noticeable, like he had not expected that tone from me. "This is not panic," he replied, sharper now. "This is a serious situation. We just reviewed the structure, and it looks like you have controlling authority over decisions that were supposed to be handled at the family level." I let that sit for a second before responding, not because I needed time, but because I wanted him to hear the silence first. "Nothing was supposed to be handled at the family level," I said evenly. "It was structured exactly the way it is now from the beginning." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear movement in the background, papers shifting, my mom's voice faint but present, asking something I could not fully make out. "That is not what we understood," he said finally. "Then that is not what you paid attention to," I replied, still calm, still measured, because this was not about proving anything. It was about stating what had always been true. The documents were clear. The terms were clear. I signed exactly what I agreed to. My mom's voice came through more clearly now, closer to the phone. "Why would you set it up like that without telling us?" she asked, and there it was again, that shift from confusion to blame, like the problem was not the structure but the fact that they had not been included in it. I exhaled quietly, not frustrated, just done explaining things that had already been decided. "I did not set it up without telling you," I said. "I set it up." That is the difference. The line went quiet for a second, and then my brother spoke, his voice closer than before, like he had stepped into the conversation fully now. "If this is accurate, then there are approvals we need from you before anything moves forward," he said carefully, choosing his words like he was navigating something unfamiliar. "That is correct," I answered without hesitation. No explanation. No softening. Just the fact. That was the moment everything changed. I could feel it in the silence that followed, heavier now, not confusion anymore but realization. The structure they had assumed was shared was not. The access they thought they had was not automatic. And the person they had treated as optional was now the one everything depended on. My dad spoke again. Slower this time, more deliberate. "Then we need to meet today and go through this together so we can align on next steps." Align. That word almost made me smile because it sounded cooperative, but I knew what it meant. Regain control. Reframe the situation. Move things back into familiar territory where they made the decisions and I supported them. "I am not available today," I said simply. Another pause, sharper this time. "You are not available," he repeated, like the concept itself did not make sense. "No," I said, just as steady as before. "I have my own schedule." My mom stepped back in, her tone softer again, shifting strategies in real time. "We are just trying to understand why you would put yourself in this position," she said. "This affects all of us." I looked down at the documents again, my name clear across the page, the authority they were now reacting to instead of recognizing before. "No," I said quietly, but firmly. "It affects you now." That is not the same thing. The silence that followed was different from before, not just a pause, but a full stop, like the conversation had reached a point they had not prepared for. Because for the first time I was not adjusting to them. They were adjusting to me. And there was nothing in their usual pattern that accounted for that. No one spoke for a few seconds after that, and the silence on the line felt heavier than anything that had been said so far, like all three of them were recalibrating in real time, trying to figure out where the ground had shifted and how to stand on it again. My dad was the first to break it, but his tone had changed, not softer, not warmer, just careful in a way I had never heard before. "We are not trying to create conflict here," he said, slower now, choosing each word instead of pushing through them. "We are trying to find a solution that works for everyone." I leaned against the table, my hand resting lightly on the documents, feeling the weight of them without looking down. "There is already a solution," I replied. "It is written out. You just did not expect it to be this one." I could hear my mom exhale quietly, like she was trying to steady herself before speaking. "Again. You are making this sound intentional," she said, her voice tighter now. "Like you set this up knowing it would put us in a difficult position." I did not answer right away, not because I needed time, but because I wanted her to hear the absence of denial. "I set it up to protect what I built," I said finally. "If that creates a difficult position, that is not the same thing as causing one." My brother spoke again, faster this time, less controlled, like the realization was catching up to him all at once. "Then what does that mean for us right now?" he asked. "Because if nothing moves without your approval, we are already behind on decisions that were supposed to be finalized this week." There it was. Not hypothetical anymore. Not theoretical. Immediate impact. I straightened slightly, not out of tension, but because this was the moment everything became practical. "It means nothing moves until I review it," I said. "And I am not rushing that process." My dad stepped in again, his voice sharper for a second before he pulled it back. "We do not have the luxury of waiting," he said. "There are timelines involved. Commitments." I let that sit for a moment, then answered in the same calm tone I had used from the beginning. "There were timelines involved yesterday too," I said. "You just did not prioritize them." The silence that followed that was different. Not confusion. Not adjustment. Something closer to recognition. Because for the first time, the timeline that mattered was not theirs. My mom spoke again, softer now, but with an edge underneath it that had not been there before. "This is not about last night," she said. "Do not turn it into something personal." I looked down at the papers in front of me, then back toward the window, the city still moving like nothing had changed. "It has always been personal," I said quietly. "You just never had to deal with the consequences of that." My brother's voice came through again, lower now, more direct. "So what are you saying?" he asked. "That you are just going to hold everything until we, what? Do things your way?" I let out a small breath, not frustrated, just steady. "I am saying I am going to make decisions based on what is actually in place," I answered. "Not what you assumed was in place." Another pause, and I could hear them shifting again, trying to find a way back into control, into familiarity, into something that felt like the structure they were used to. But there was nothing to grab onto anymore. My dad spoke one more time, and now his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, not weak, but contained. "We need to understand what you want from this," he said. I thought about that for a second, not because I did not know, but because I had never been asked that question in this context before. Not seriously. Not when it mattered. "I want you to recognize what is already true," I said. "That is all." The line went silent again, and this time it stayed that way longer, like they were finally sitting with something instead of trying to move around it. Because there was no immediate fix for this. No quick conversation that would shift things back into place. This was structure. This was authority. This was something they could not talk their way out of. And for the first time, I could hear it in their voices, in the pauses, in the way they chose their words now. They were not trying to convince me anymore. They were trying to figure out how to operate without the control they thought they had. I could hear it in the way no one rushed to fill the silence this time, like they had finally reached a point where there was nothing left to negotiate around, no angle left to soften the reality of it, and for the first time in my life, I was not the one stepping in to make things easier. My dad cleared his throat quietly, a small sound that carried more weight than anything he had said before. So what happens next? He asked, and there was something different in the question, not authority, not expectation, just uncertainty. I let that sit for a second, not to make a point, but because I wanted to answer it without falling back into old habits. Next, I said, steady and calm, I review everything that is currently pending, and I decide what moves forward and what does not. No explanation, no apology, no adjustment. Just the structure as it actually existed. My mom spoke again, her voice softer than it had been all morning, but there was no control behind it now, just something quieter, something closer to realization. You are really not going to help us fix this quickly, she said. I looked down at my hand resting on the edge of the table, then back toward the window, the light shifting again as the morning moved forward without waiting for any of us. I am not going to rush something that was never urgent to you, I answered. There was a pause after that, longer than any before, and this time it did not feel tense. It felt final. My brother let out a quiet breath on the other end, not frustrated, not angry, just different. We should have paid more attention, he said, almost to himself, but loud enough for all of us to hear. That was the first honest thing anyone had said since the call started. No deflection. No reframing. Just a simple acknowledgement that something had been overlooked. My dad did not respond to that, and I could tell he was processing it in his own way, the same way he always had, internally, methodically, but without the certainty he usually carried. We will wait to hear from you, he said finally, and even that sentence sounded unfamiliar coming from him, like he was trying on a role he had never had to play before. I nodded slightly, even though they could not see it. That would be best, I replied. My mom said my name then, softer than before, almost careful, like she was testing whether there was still something she could reach for. We did not think it would turn into this, she said. I did not answer right away, not because I was holding anything back, but because there was nothing left to explain. It did not turn into anything, I said finally. It was always this. You just did not look at it. That was the last thing I said before ending the call, not abruptly, not with tension, just finished. The line went quiet, and I stood there for a second with the phone still in my hand, listening to the absence of their voices, the absence of expectation, the absence of the role I had carried for so long without realizing how much it shaped everything. I set the phone down slowly on the table next to the documents, both of them now completely still, no movement, no urgency, just the reality of what had been there the entire time. I walked over to the window again, looking out at the street below, the same steady rhythm, people moving forward with their day, and for the first time, I felt like I was moving forward with mine in a way that did not depend on anyone else catching up. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of winning, just a quiet clarity that settled deeper the longer I stood there. Because this was never about proving them wrong. It was about no longer needing them to be right about me. I turned away from the window, picked up the documents one more time, and stacked them neatly, placing them in a folder like something complete, something decided. My phone did not ring again after that. No messages, no follow-ups, no attempts to reopen the conversation immediately. Just silence. And for the first time it did not feel like something was missing. It felt like something had finally stopped. They chose where to be when it mattered to me, and I chose what to be when it finally mattered to them. And that difference was the only answer I needed.